Okay, before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between finite games and infinite games, because that's really at the heart of what Matt and I are going to be talking about in a few minutes. Spoilers. When you think about a game, a finite game is a game where, according to Simon Sinek, who's written the book Infinite Games, you have known players. You know who the opponents are going to be. You have fixed rules, maybe interpreted differently, but they're fixed rules. Everybody knows the rules. And then finally, there are defined objectives. We know who wins. We know who loses. We know who ties. All of that good, fun stuff. And those are the things that we most commonly associate with sports, but we often associate with life. An infinite game, on the other hand, we don't necessarily know. We have both known and unknown players, and they may change, and not always when we realize it. And rules also change sometimes when we don't realize it. And there could be multiple versions of rules and different people operating with different understandings or acceptance of the rules. And then finally, the objectives. The objectives change and are subjective. So life is kind of an infinite game, but it's so much easier to play as a finite game. Now, let's talk with Matt and get more into this stuff. So, identity theft.
Yeah, apparently. That's the topic of the day. I was just playing a game with you, you might say, Bob.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is going to be good because that's what we're going to be talking about here on Biz Tech Twists. Wow.
Shocked.
This is almost like it's planned or something, which I can
serendipitous.
Absolutely. I forgot we're going to have like 5 and 6 syllable words here because our guests.
Some of them made up.
Absolutely. And there should be a contest that goes on for that. And if there ever is, I'm putting my money on my guest, Matt Lee, who's a security and compliance director or senior security and compliance director over at PAX 8 and one of our biggest partners over when it comes to cybersecurity over at Simplex-IT. And Matt, you and I have gone back and forth on many topics and many times. Why don't you give a little background of yourself?
Yeah, so I started as a break-fix technician at a break-fix MSP, burgeoning upon being an MSP in 2011. And we grew that company. I was able to buy in from 7 of us to 170 of us and exit at a $40 million revenue, supporting the lives of 15,000 or so humans and 20,000 endpoints. And through that lens, learning how to secure them in a more effective and efficacious fashion by loss and by failure and by growth. And then when I left there and sold that, I wanted to do something where I could take that loss and knowledge gained from it and help others not necessarily suffer same. So I educate and I teach, and I'm also part of a lot of subject matter expertise working groups. But yeah, you and I have had a fun time together trying to do exactly that with your populace over the last few years of trying to educate and drive change and help empower business. So glad to be here, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Cool. And I gotta say that the 2 words that really drive home here are drive change, because whenever we talk about technology, that has to be in the next sentence is the word change. And whether it be through the growth of your organization, as well as dealing with cybersecurity and all that, that's something that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals have difficulty with. And one of the problems, and this is why I chose this topic and also immediately thought of you, is that it's not a traditional business problem in that technology and as well as security, it never ends. You're never done, if you will. And you and I have talked on more than one occasion on the whole concept of games. And Simon Sinek, who has some great YouTube videos and the like, he also wrote a great book. He didn't invent the concept, but he's probably popularized it more than anybody else on the term infinite game. And that's what I asked you to join me to talk about, because I think it's just a fascinating topic and one that really helps us understand better how to deal with all of the constant change that we're faced with. So
yeah, it's a good juxtaposition, right? Because you think of, breaking it down, what is a finite game in juxtaposition to an infinite game? And so in my mind, Bob, that would be defined as clear defined outcomes, predefined sets of stimuli and inputs, right? Predefined structures of how someone scores or succeeds, and without a lot of delta in the game, even if it has some delta. Think of them as house rules or, right, those kind of changes in delta. But when you think about that on the obverse of this, back to the thought of an infinite game, I don't know if that's just a great way to make it make sense in your head, or if it's this understanding of when you're talking about cybersecurity or technology in today's day, you're talking through a lot of the upcoming of risk and technical debt and all the things that are then coming together at this one magical moment in time where things are changing so rapidly, new muscles are asking to be formed, new ways to play the game are having to come out, and it's never going to change and it's never going to stop changing. And I don't know if that's a bit of a misnomer, or if that's, a bit of a just way to understand that the sea of possibilities is so large, we probably don't ever cross the breadth of it. But the point I think you're trying to bring up is, in an infinite game, it's how you play the game very, very much more so, because there is not a finality to it. There's not an outcome or a score or something that ends the game. Whereas with a finite game, I could probably win in bad ways, but still be okay. The long outcome of an infinite game means you probably can't, unless you're playing quote unquote meta, right? If that makes sense. But anyway, sorry.
No, you don't need to apologize for once. No, I think the whole concept of finite games, I mean, you know the players. There's 2 teams in baseball. There's 9 players on each side with some substitutions, but it's limited. You know who you're playing against. And the rules are defined. Some people may cheat, some people may interpret them, but we're encapsulating things. So it's a known structure. And you know what a point is. You know what a run or a goal or a success or a failure is. So you know these things, and you can almost apply binary logic to say yes or no. And we're comfortable. My God, we love that. We love to be able to say we did this, we didn't do this. Or
that was a 2-point basket. That was a 3-point basket.
Exactly.
That one was negated, right? Like it's
right. Exactly. Yeah. And boy, does that make it easy for life. When we take a look, whether we're talking about personal or business or professional, whatever, when we're able to say we know exactly what those parameters are, and like what you were talking about, we know what the parameters are. We don't have to worry about it. But it never really is that way, except when you're playing a specific game. Okay, or Monopoly, because Monopoly never freaking ends.
Or apparently marriage. My wife is always correct.
She's told me that.
Yep. Similarly informed.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I have the same marital status. So yes.
Yeah. When you think about it though, or go ahead.
No, go.
When you think about it though, on an infinite game, I think when I said my concept of you have to learn to play in it and it's how you play that matters, think of it this way. If you need finality or a finite rule and something's going to shift, would you be better served being able to understand shifting than being able to understand a rule? And what I mean by that is, if you think about living in an infinite game, if the rules are never quite concrete, even though they might exist, they, like, for example, and I bring it back to cybersecurity, but there's other places you could take this. But if you imagine that 5 years ago, participating in a cyber incident is fine. There's not a lot of risk in that. Now, participating in a cyber incident, there may be need for expertise and someone to actually go to court and testify, and there might need to be external forensics and external provability and separation of duties and all these things that become part of that. Is it better to be able to predict that that's going to be needed and thusly have a great documentation system and a good incident response plan? So I guess what I'm getting at is, when you start playing an infinite game, it's better to be a good player. Right. And it's better to be able to see and watch the changes, which then means you're deeply rooted in the understanding of what's happening around you, or else you could never watch that. Think of like a bond trader even, or stocks or different things there. While they might have some finality, I guess it's the breadth of it and the ever changing present dependence and interdependence that comes into play.
Well, and actually you could take a look at, like, for example, in the investment world for IPOs. The IPO on that first day may skyrocket, but on the second day, not so much. But the third day, it then comes back a little bit, so on and so forth. Right. So when you start talking about, did I win, did I lose, you have to take a look at in what context. What's the time frame that I'm looking for? And if you're looking for someone who wants to get in and get out, they could then encapsulate the definition of that one iteration, that one game, that one moment as, yes, I won, because I
Yes.
got out with this much gain and I didn't
Yeah.
have this much of a risk. Whereas another person who's in for the long game, for lack of a better word, they're going to have to take their gains losses in a longer context, time wise. So
And sometimes on faith, right? When you think about that longer play, sometimes you have every evidence that loss is occurring, and every evidence. I'll give you a great example of this, Bob. This is the first time I ever got experience with this. I was a banker. I was a private banker, and this was in 2008-ish, maybe 7-ish. It might have even been a couple of years before that. But the bank that I was with was a national bank, and they were forming a fraud division to investigate all these fraud claims that started happening, green dot cards, stuff like that back then. Mm-hmm. And I was the smart aleck young kid in the back of the room. And when they came up, they showed a data chart that showed 4 fraud cases, 6 fraud cases, 700 fraud cases, 740, 748, 760, 800 over this quarter period, right? And the interesting part about this was I stood up and said, well, sounds like y'all started a fraud department and created all the fraud. But the point I'm trying to make is what they'd really done was started to identify that fraud, started to identify that there's challenges there, start to identify the rules, start to create the rules around these things, start to, find paths towards it. And so I think the interesting part, though, is sometimes you get data that would say to you, man, we got tons of fraud now. We've got all these problems. A little hyperbolisly in this example, but you have data now. It says, oh my God, we have way more fraud than we used to have, and we have way more problems and way more incidents. And I think that when you start transitioning to an infinite game, you start getting into taking some leaps of faith that the data will trend down over time, potentially, right? And then as you see that happen, finally 2 years later, you're like, great. We're there. And back to you and me talking about making change with organizations and in technology. It's often a relayed or delayed gratification in some of those incidents too.
But also, no matter what you do, you have to take a look at that gratification. You have to take a look at that risk, either side of that equation. And you have to say, okay, but then what? What happens at that point? Because it's not the end of the game, as much as we'd love to say it is. Because when a business or an individual accomplishes something, you don't the next day say, and now we're done.
And now we're done.
The two terms, and they lived happily ever after. No story really ends that way.
Yeah.
The story ends with, and then Monday, who knows?
Well, I mean, it's almost like if you look at an Instagram perspective, right? And I live a little bit of this life in LinkedIn, but that moment, that picture, the smiles, everybody being where they're at, you still have to use the restroom later, and you still have to go move on and do the next thing or make the next task or run to the next car and next meeting, whatever it may be. I think to your point, life continues, everything continues. And when you think about it from the focus of a business, especially, you're always changing. I mean, even in the movie theater industry, you change or die. In almost every industry, you change or die. And so I think to your point, it's constantly moving and shifting as we go on. And the interesting part is we only have such a really small microcosm of the game cycle in our life cycle too, right? Like if you think about it as humans, pure humans.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet you see the same cycles play out for the last hundreds and hundreds of years, at that larger, grander scale too. But anyways.
And yet we still have to, if we talk about it from, okay, we've got the finite game. And that's the one that humans understand the best because it does have a beginning. It does have an end. It does have known pieces surrounding it and the like. So we are going to approach life with a finite game mindset. And that works tactically.
At short window sprints.
Right, exactly. But we need to also understand the fact that it doesn't work for everything and it doesn't necessarily work strategically. So if an organization sits back and says, we need to have a 20% annual revenue increase this year, do they sacrifice next year's revenue by doing outrageous things that they won't be able to replicate? Well, it depends on what their need is. But at the end of the year, they're going to be starting off, over again, and they have to be accountable or they have to take into account whatever they've left behind in order to achieve those short-term goals. And you could almost make the case that, does that happen in sports? Well, it happens in sports sort of, because if you've got a player who is playing somewhat hurt, you may want to rest them, even if it increases the chances of losing this particular game, but they'll be better set to play the following game or the like.
Yeah.
But
you see examples of the other direction too, where sports teams trade off very needed draft picks, if you will, right, for stupid small gains today or things that are painful today. And so you see a lack of strategic alignment with some of those choices.
Okay, I'm in Cleveland, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Literally.
No, but you have to, and you have to take a look at the same thing, both finitely and infinitely. And to be able to interchange, go between them is important, because to an organization, again, you may know the known players. You're competing. You want to sign up a new client. So who are the players in this? It's you and that potential client, plus maybe a couple of other competitors that you're going against. The fixed rules. I'm going to make a proposal. You're going to either take that or not take that. And then the defined objectives. I want them to sign the contract. That's what I want them to do. That's not a long-term marketing plan. That's
Correct.
Not a process by which we're going to bring on a whole sales pipeline and bring in potential clients and keep them going and all of that kind of fun stuff. But it's a subset of that. And to be able to switch from that perspective, where we're very finite driven, and then this infinite where we don't know who the players are because we don't know who the potential clients are. We don't know who our leads are or the like. And the rules are changeable because, let's talk cyber. Everything changes constantly in cybersecurity at, 4 times the speed.
Yeah. And in the same breath, maintaining a finite view on that conversation, there's still things that people do today that haven't changed for 10 years and people are still doing them. And so those are some of the concepts that living in more of a finite view of some of these things and solving some of those pieces would be more effective tactically, right? And even if you looked at it from a strategic perspective, it is as a zoomed out aspect of trying to play a game where you don't know the variables, but even the ones you do know, you have a very poor adherence to and a very poor, almost out of the blue wise ability to deliver those things too. So that game in itself is also shifting in that regard. But I think, though, to your point of applying a finite game rule to an infinite problem, we see the similar things in calculus and in math, right? You have crutches, if you will, that are whole fields of math that overcome a larger problem not yet solved or a larger problem defined, right? When you think of calculus and some of the core things that get derived from that, no, maybe pun intended, but I think you're applying small tactical chunks. When you think about calculus and its, let's say, approach to the area of a circle, it's let's take these smaller and smaller and smaller pieces approaching infinity and calculate what those would have been as they were in smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, thereby leaving off less, rounded off, right? And so it's trying to approach an infinite problem with finite problems to a larger scale, if that makes sense, right? And so I think maybe we're getting off the rails here a bit, but I do believe in business applying those small, what do I have to get to do today, but also transitioning out to that infinite game of what are the variables, right? You look at different techniques, SWOTs out there, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, all the different types of ways, but forcing people to live in that strategic mindset that's assessing these other things that might be new players to you, right? You might be unaware someone opened up this weird delivery service for food that might change an entire restaurant industry, right? So,
or you might not be aware that your mainframes can be replaced by these desktop personal computers.
Sure.
Which IBM didn't realize, even though they were making the same product
for a long time. Yeah.
So you could have that. But you bring up an interesting point. If an organization has both tactical plans and strategic plans, however you're going to be doing it, EOS system or
StratOps, name it,
whatever, you could almost think of it from the standpoint of you need to test your day-to-day, your tactical operations and requirements. You can almost make those finite games.
Yeah.
Okay. You can almost make those. Yeah, we're going to have a beginning. We're going to have an end. We're going to have specific rules, requirements, what people are doing. This is how we're going to score it. These are KPIs, all that kind of fun stuff. But you then take a look at your organization and you say, what are we going to do long term? And the long term, if you hold to the same finite game concept for your long-term strategic goals and operations, you're pretty much saying we're going to be doing roughly the same type of thing or using the same type of vision that we're using today. which if you're making something that hasn't changed, or the way you make it hasn't changed for the last 20 years, that might be a safe bet. But the number of people in that world, I think, are few and far between at this point. So the question would be, can you make your strategic plans more from an infinite mindset? Meaning that what are the unknowns that you're going to be working with? What are the changing rules? What are the objectives that are going to be malleable? I hate to say it.
Yeah. Well, you triggered me on a nowable conversation, but maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. It brings up the word Disney drawer, but oh man, and that got me off on a tangent there. Hold on just a sec, Bob. They're going to edit this anyway, or not. I don't care.
I was going to say,
watch me struggle. When you think about, oh man, it was a really good point.
Was it?
Yeah, it was a good. As you would describe it.
Let's name him Larry. Larry the good point.
Larry the good point. He died a death today. Unexpected.
We'll miss Larry.
Poor Larry.
Are you fed up with reactive IT providers who take too long to respond, let problems fester, and nickel and dime you for every little thing? Say goodbye to those frustrations by choosing Simplex-IT, home of Amazon's best-selling author and BizTech Twist host Bob Coppedge. As Northeast Ohio's friendly neighborhood MSP, Simplex-IT has been providing top-notch managed and co-managed IT services since 2007, supporting hundreds of clients locally and across the United States. With a managed service provider like Simplex-IT, you'll benefit from proactive maintenance, 24/7 monitoring, and streamlined technology that will help you grow your business. Visit simplex-it.com for more information and to start experiencing stress-free IT today.
No, but on your point of the Disney drawer conversation of if it's nowable, right? In this point of can we do this now, I think as you meant it, and it's back to this point of how can you live strategically and think outside the box? And this is where I go back to an infinite game. Rewinding. I found Larry. Rewinding. Will you tell me if Larry's good or not?
Okay.
Rewinding. At some point, you to play a finite game, you can study the rules. You could let them punch you in the face until you learn them, vis-a-vis Monopoly and Matt Lee's experience with Monopoly, right? Or you can play things in a way that at some point approximates 90, 100% pretty easily from a game rule perspective because of its adoption methodology, right? You can read it, you can learn it. In the same breath, when you think about rules, to your question of how can you assess this from that perspective, they also, too, in an infinite game, they exist. Rules exist. They exist. They change, but they exist. There's forces. There's things that push you in a direction. There's opportunities. There's winds. There's currents of change.
Right.
You have those things in an infinite game. And so for me, I think the things that make me actually really successful at being a technical person is that I framework things so well. I can abstract this and hang it off that next piece and understand where it connects and how it rotates and what it does and those pieces. And so you build this contextual map. Well, when you're playing in an infinite game and you're trying to find those opportunities as a business that are outside your normal wheelhouse, you have a challenge because you only have your paradigm. So that's the first aspect of this. You can only see it from that tactical finite game you've created to live in. Right. I do these papers and these reports go on this desk until some dudes burns down my place for a red stapler. Right.
That could make a movie.
Make a movie on Office Space or something. Office Spruce. Office Spruce. But you think about that way. So my advice, TLDR, would be when you're in an infinite game, the best thing you can do is ask questions. The best thing you can do is challenge your own paradigm, right? How do you live strategically? You question the reality you live from. You question the framework that you've used to define what you do as a business or as a human or as whatever that might be, because it's not that you always look for a no. It's not that you're always looking to destroy what you believe, but you're definitely looking to challenge. Is it correct for the moment? Have the rules changed? Is there something I don't understand? Is there an opportunity that would not have gone recognized? And think of it this way. Look back at Netflix, for example, right? When they made that shift from slinging discs that I mail you and then some idiot mails me back with dog tooth marks in it, evidently, right? To this shift of I'm going to do online streaming content when there's no demand. Nobody's done it. The infrastructure doesn't exist. Akamai barely exists to deliver the CDNs. None of this is possible today. We're going to do this. When their competitors doing a Redbox, right? Or a Blockbuster. If you hadn't had the ability to ask, is this the right delivery mechanism? Should I mail DVDs? Should I be buying physical copies in a world where something's changing to now digital rights managements and DRM capabilities? Like, should I? Those questions come from a place of questioning your own paradigm, right? And that's tough for people. So how do you live in an infinite game? I think you have to question the game constantly.
Don't you? I mean, you could extend that to be you just have to question.
Yeah.
You have to question who are the players. In an evolving marketplace, you look at how many organizations are now saying, why aren't I selling internationally? Why aren't I selling both commercially as well as consumer? Why can't I take whatever the value is? We have to define what the value is that the organization is creating. Are they creating opportunities to extend? Now we get into the whole blue ocean, red ocean concept,
sure,
which is another conversation. But by asking those questions, you're basically saying, should we be adding players or should we be removing players? We cater to this particular customer audience, but they're the ones who don't make us any money. They're the ones who don't work well with our values. Call that whatever you want to. And the same thing. Sometimes the rules can change externally. Cybersecurity being a great example on that one. And sometimes the rules can change internally because you found better ways to do it because we questioned. And again, the same thing as far as what do we call scores? What do we call points? What do we call wins? What do we call losses? We can
revenue and profit. I mean, at least in our world in business, right? It's typically.
Well, but our organizations now making the change so they can also say employee satisfaction, which they didn't have to a couple of years ago. And the companies or the organizations that are saying, no, they're just malcontents, are losing employees and not knowing how to find them and wondering what the heck happened. Whereas the companies who are saying, no, we want to make it so that our employees are happy or whatever that emotional term is that I'm not familiar with. So they're
competence, Bob.
Yeah, I guess.
Edit that one out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know about. No, but it's one of those where by making changes dynamically, because the rules are changing, the players are changing. Organizations who are essentially saying, so I'm going to change along with it. You don't know what the final score is going to be because who knows what's going to happen 2 years from now.
Yeah. Well, and if you take it, I mean, to your point of the shifting sands of what that expectation are from an internal risk perspective, right? Like what is one of my weaknesses or risks, right? Or threats, if you will, is that insider retention, more and more life/work balance. I mean, even if you think about the terminology, we'd use work-life balance. Work was first, right? So you see this shift in the world where that's becoming a reality or a possibility, if you will. And also then with the pandemic shifting so many of these things of where you hire someone from, technology has been enabled and empowered. And so you're seeing more and more of that. But I'll take this back to like even Netflix in a second win. So let's say you've already made this prescient decision, if you will, or semi-prescient decision to go from physical media to digital media. That's a huge move. Well, then they started making their own show content, right, Bob? And you'd think this is great. They're all wins.
Right.
You had this kind of semi-prescient, again, at the top decision to say, no, we're killing and canceling wins. Some of our favorite shows on Netflix were canceled because they felt that they were being too successful. And if you listen to my conversation about, tech debt and innovation debt, this falls in the side of innovation debt side of things, right? But if you think about it for an infinite game, they realized we're just redoing the same stuff over and over again and being hyper successful at it, but we're not actually learning anything new. We're not actually doing anything new. We're just spreading out how many shows we can sling against the wall.
Right.
We have to commit some resources to failure. And I think that's the other part of an infinite game is you have to commit resources to failure. Now, sometimes you don't plan it and you just have to be good at getting punched. But I think you have to be willing to, I think the best compliment I ever got in my life, Bob, was that I hold extremely loosely to passionate beliefs. And it's this understanding that you have to be willing to understand when things change, to accept failure, to be willing to say this was a bad idea or a great idea that ran its course or whatever it may be. But I think that's the other part of an infinite game in business is being dynamic about failing.
Well, and I think actually that's probably a great example. And because when we fail, a lot of people say, well, that's the end of the game. That's it. We're done.
Yeah.
There's no more to go to. Well, in an infinite game, it's like, well, that round is over. That particular aspect of it is over, but it starts over again or it continues. Depending
Are you familiar with the term roguelike games? in video games. There's a term
No.
called roguelike or the rogue series. And I may be misquoting. My kids may like come in here and shun me, but close enough. So in a roguelike scroller, you start out, there's a couple of different variants, but you start out with a character and you run through a map and you pick up attributes, but you pick up gear. But if you die, you start again at the very beginning with nothing, except for some of the attributes potentially, or except for some aided skills you've gained, or except for, and I use this a little bit as a comparison of those games that are driven are an infinite game, that in the sense that you're just going to keep climbing, keep getting better, higher scores, capability,
Right.
a little bit of growth, but for the most part, infinite. And they're attractive in the sense that you learn from each failure and therefore continue to grow. And that's not a bit separated from a realism of life, right? If you had stopped after the first girl you asked out said no, would you have met your wife potentially?
Mm-hmm.
And I know, Bob, you're so good looking and charismatic that you probably had a yes from the first time you met somebody you liked, but in your mid 30s, coming out of your Star Wars, John. Wait, Star Trek. That's right, Star Trek.
Yeah, I don't do the kid stuff. Star Trek, yes, absolutely.
I tease, yeah, for sure. But when you think about that infinite game requires failure, where a lot of times failure in a finite game isn't as rewarded. If I don't make all my basketball shots, or if I don't, and maybe I'm getting a little bit too out on an edge here, but I do think that you can take some losses and learn from them and gain more than you would have summatively had out of its success.
And I would say that's both personal and professional. You know, if you're looking at your own life and you fail at something, if you look at it from a finite standpoint, you're going to go, oh my God, this is horrible. We'll never, I'll never be able to do fill in the blank again. Whereas if you look at it more from an infinite standpoint, more of an opportunity.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
yep. And yeah, that is the takeaway, I think, is if you look at just zooming out, and maybe we've just played an infinite game with somebody that's already repeated this in history. But I mean, if you think about whether we think we can or we cannot, we are usually correct. Right. Yeah. And you apply that same principle to, if I fail, you better imagine I'm coming up with another tactic to fail or succeed at next. Right. And so if some people fail or some businesses fail, it is well, that's it. Wrap it up. Close up the doors. We're done here. This is over. To your point. So.
Yeah. All right. Sum it up. If someone was wanting to use an infinite game concept, well, actually, no. One last thing I do want to talk about, and this is going to be hopefully we got to make this one quick. Infinite game. How does that work from a cybersecurity standpoint? I know I got my opinions, but I want to hear yours.
So for me, it's about understanding the delta. So living in ways to control the delta, right? If you're saying, I understand there will always be change, I won't ever know all the pieces, I won't ever understand then get a good way to structure the delivery of that. And what I mean by that is a couple things. You wouldn't shoot from the hip. You'd think of, how am I going to analyze change? And the real quick summation is, in cybersecurity, we often refer to it as the NIST wheel. And the NIST wheel is identify your stuff, know what you got, know what you're protecting, right? Protect your stuff, put out assets. And that's usually where most people stop thinking about cybersecurity. But after that, you have detect, figure out some bad guy or gal's doing something nefarious, respond, take action, stop the threat, right? And then recover from this, do the damage control, figure it out. But it's a wheel for a reason, and it points back into identify for a reason. It's not a graphical glitch. It's not a failure. Mm-hmm. It's an understanding that after you fail, after the threat actor wins, after the growth of their capabilities exceeded the growth of our capabilities, the only way to make those come back to the same, or back to a winning state where I'm at least repeating and gaining each level, would be for me to then do an after action review, dig into what I could have been better about. How could I have improved my original identification of what I have? Did I miss something? How can I be better at protecting against these types of threats and vectors that I'm now learning about? How can I do a better job at responding to those challenges once I find them after I've detected them? How can I do a better job of recovering and making it seamless to the user experience and less risk and less damage to me as a business? So when you think about cybersecurity, it's the same concepts. It really is question things, right? Did something fail? Can I be better with humility and transparency? And it's about looking towards some cyclic nature of improvement. And that's nothing special. That's life. That's everything. That's a weight loss plan. That's a learning a language. That's a growing a business. That's a everything. It's about that cyclic application and layer. And I think what happens in cyber is people get to either a layer of fatigue or a layer of complacency that allows them to say that wheel is spinning when there's really no activity. But ultimately, it's about continuing to ensure that you're getting data points that change your perspective or validate your perspective with a unbiased and unfortunately sometimes paradigmically broken view of what we're doing. But TLDR, continue to try to improve by asking after every action, can I do something better in those 5 categories in cybersecurity?
Cool. I look at it from a different perspective, but I think we're almost saying the same thing. The bad guys are incentivized. They are financially incentivized. They are power, information, data incentivized to be always inventing new ways to accomplish their goals, which is to basically damage us or to steal information or value from us. And as long as that happens, and they are doing so against technology that is also always changing and always advancing, because we're always finding new tools, new ways to do things. So this threat is never going to go away. And especially since so many of the bad actors are working in countries that are very, very well protected. So there's no incentive for that business model from the bad guys to go away. So this is always going to be, there's always going to be this 3 months from now, there's going to be a new threat. 6 months from now, there's going to be a new threat. 9 months from now, there's going to be a new threat, and so on and so forth. And that's going to continue to go. New players are going to be brought in, new bad guys, new companies who are going to have great security, great strategies. The rules are going to change because the technology is changing. And so everything is going to be constantly evolving in terms of how the bad guys try to attack or the like. And then finally, the objectives. Bad guys are finding more and more ways to use and to sell the things that they get access to or outright steal. So it is infinite. And so to the person who sits back and says, my God, does this never end? The answer is no, and you shouldn't expect it to.
Yeah. Unless you're one of those pieces that is meant to be depleted on the board. And that's the challenge, is that there is a real outcome of this, that the threat actors are financially incentivized because they're stealing it from you. And when you start thinking about that, the you being editorial, obviously, of all of anyone listening. Mm-hmm. But the point is, when you think about that, that's a finality maybe for you if you don't decide to be an infinite game, right? If you don't decide that I'm going to invest in keeping up with a real and present threat, right? And I give you a great example. If something that you used in your business became exorbitantly expensive to the point the market would not bear and there was another alternate, you would switch to that alternate, period. I don't care what business you're in. That's the way it works. And so when you think about that from a finite or an infinite game around cybersecurity, it's ever changing. And you're just saying, I don't want to know. That's fine. But understand, it's just like saying you don't want to know about those exorbitant changes in your market conditions. And that price is one that's paid when it's paid, and you don't get much choice in it if you're not doing the right things, right? You can't transfer that risk because you're not going to be insurable. You had the head of cybersecurity saying, or the head of Zurich's cybersecurity insurance space saying it may become uninsurable. So you get into this point where, yes, it's an infinite game, and applying it from a security perspective takes that willingness to understand that other guy or gal on the other side of the table is an entrepreneur doing the same stuff in a way that they believe in doing, and oftentimes state sanctioned and or sponsored for espionage reasons. So anyway, sorry, you pulled my chain, Bob. You know you did. Okay.
It's what I do. So Matt, if someone wants to reach out and learn more about you and what you do and all that, how do they do it?
I don't know, turn over a rock probably at this point.
Yeah.
But I get around. No, I tease. LinkedIn's my preference. I still prefer LinkedIn for a connection. I have cybermattlee.com. Also Facebook cybermattlee. Pretty much anywhere cybermattlee. I did realize, Bob, the first time I've said this publicly, I actually could change my first name to Cyber. And I go by my middle name, and so I actually could be cybermattlee.
I think you could.
Yeah, it's glorious. My wife supports it, so that could be interesting. I told her she made a mistake.
Oh, she knows.
She does.
Okay. Well, Matt, thanks very much for, first of all, helping out with some of the troubleshooting we had, and for being one of the first guests here for the BizTech Twists. And to everybody else, thank you for joining in, and have a great day. Take care.